Imagine you are dying of thirst. Your throat is a desert of cracked clay, your tongue a swollen stone. Every cell in your body screams for water. Someone places a cool, clear glass before you. You reach for it with a trembling hand, driven by a biological imperative as old as life itself. But as the glass nears your lips, an invisible force seizes you. Your muscles contort into agonizing spasms. Your throat clamps shut, your back arches violently, and a guttural, inhuman sound escapes your lungs. You recoil from the very substance you need to survive, filled with a terror so profound, so alien, it feels like a demonic possession. This isn't a nightmare. This is hydrophobia, the defining symptom of a rabies infection in its final, horrifying stage. Your own nervous system, the seat of your consciousness, has been hijacked. It has been rewired by a microscopic parasite to fear life-giving water. This virus doesn't just kill you, it transforms you. It turns a living, thinking being into a marionette of aggression and fear, a perfect vessel for its own propagation. What kind of evolutionary monster achieves this? Why does this ancient disease orchestrate such a bizarre and theatrical death? A sequence of horrors that seems more like a malevolent curse than a biological process. And how did humanity defeat an enemy that is, even today, in 2026, 100% fatal once these symptoms begin? The answer is not just a story of science, but a story of our deepest fears, of the terrifying fragility of the mind, and of a desperate gamble that changed medicine forever. To understand this neurological horror, we must travel back to July 4th, 1885, in the small village of Meisengot, Alsace. Here we meet a 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister. On that day, Joseph was walking to school when a dog, its eyes glazed and foam dripping from its jaws, lunged at him. It was a brutal, relentless attack. The dog's owner, a local grocer, had to beat the animal with an iron bar to free the boy. Joseph was savaged. He was covered in 14 deep bites and lacerations on his hands, legs, and thighs, wounds contaminated with the animal's saliva. His parents rushed him to the local doctor, who could do little more than clean the wounds with carbolic acid and deliver a devastating prognosis. The dog was rabid, and the boy was doomed. His death was not a question of if, but when, and it would be agonizing. In the 19th century, rabies was an absolute death sentence. There was no treatment, no cure, no hope. Victims were known to descend into a violent delirium, thrashing and biting, before paralysis and a final, suffocating convulsion ended their torment. The personal stakes for Joseph Meister were absolute. He was facing a certain and terrifying death. But his mother, Theodorine Meister, refused to accept this fate. She had heard whispers of a scientist in Paris, a chemist named Louis Pasteur, who was experimenting with a radical, unproven treatment for the disease. It was a desperate, almost insane hope. 2 days after the attack, she bundled her wounded son onto a train and began the long journey to Paris, racing against an invisible enemy that was already beginning its silent, inexorable march through her child's body. She was not just taking her son to a doctor, she was delivering him to the center of a scientific firestorm, placing him in the hands of a man who would have to choose between saving one boy and risking his entire career on a procedure that could easily be condemned as murder. The terror that drove Theodorine Meister to Paris was not new. It was ancient, a primal fear embedded in the human psyche for millennia. Rabies, from the Latin word rabere, to be mad, has haunted humanity since the dawn of civilization. The Mesopotamian laws of Eshnunna, written nearly 4,000 years ago, prescribed heavy fines for the owner of a mad dog whose bite caused a man's death. The ancient Greeks called it lyssa, meaning frenzy or rage, a word that would later be given to the virus itself. For most of history, the disease was inseparable from the supernatural. It was a curse, a form of demonic possession that could transform the most loyal and beloved family dog into a slavering, aggressive monster overnight. And when that madness was passed to a human, the results were even more terrifying. The victim's personality would warp, their voice would grow hoarse, and they would become consumed by a horrifying delirium. The link to werewolves and other shape-shifting monsters in folklore is no coincidence. It is the terrified attempt of a pre-scientific mind to explain the inexplicable transformation of man into beast. By the 19th century, the era of superstition was beginning to wane in the face of scientific inquiry. Louis Pasteur and his contemporaries were championing the new germ theory of disease, the radical idea that invisible microbes, not miasmas or divine wrath, were the cause of sickness. Yet, the agent of rabies remained a ghost. It was too small to be seen with the finest microscopes of the day, and unlike bacteria such as anthrax, it could not be grown in a laboratory culture dish. This invisibility only amplified the fear. With no understanding of its cause and no possibility of a cure, the response was one of brutal pragmatism. Victims were often smothered with pillows or intentionally bled to death by their own families, a horrifying act of mercy to end their suffering and protect others. This was the world that Joseph Meister was born into, a world where the bite of a dog was a countdown to madness and death, a world where science had no answers and fear reigned absolute. To truly comprehend the viral puppeteer that held Joseph Meister's life in its grasp, we must embark on a journalistic investigation into the agent itself. The rabies virus, a member of the Lyssavirus genus, is a masterpiece of malevolent evolution. Under an electron microscope, it has a distinct, almost elegant bullet shape. This structure is a marvel of biological efficiency, containing just 5 proteins and a single strand of RNA, its genetic blueprint. According to a 2024 comprehensive review in the Annals of Virology, this simplicity is the key to its terrifying success. The virus is not a living organism in the traditional sense. It is a microscopic machine built for one purpose: invasion and replication. Its journey begins in the saliva of an infected animal. When a rabid animal bites, it injects the virus into the muscle and subcutaneous tissue of its new host. Here, the virus performs its first crucial act of deception. Unlike many viruses that quickly enter the bloodstream, triggering a massive and immediate immune response, the rabies virus plays a stealth game. Its glycoprotein spikes on its outer shell are designed to bind specifically to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, which are densely concentrated at the neuromuscular junction, the precise point where nerve cells communicate with muscle fibers. It is, as one virologist described it, like having a key to a secret back door into the body's most secure network. Once attached, it enters the peripheral nerve cell. And now, the clock starts ticking. The virus begins a slow, silent journey, a process known as retrograde axonal transport. It hijacks the neuron's internal transportation system, the very molecular motors that the cell uses to send signals, and forces them to carry it backward up the long nerve fiber toward the spinal cord. It travels at a rate of only about 12 to 24 millimeters per day, completely hidden from the body's immune surveillance systems. During this incubation period, which can last for weeks, months, or in rare cases, even years, the victim is entirely asymptomatic. They feel perfectly healthy. They may have forgotten the bite or scratch entirely. But inside them, the viral assassin is marching silently toward its target, the central nervous system. Once the rabies virus reaches the spinal cord, it has breached the final firewall. It now has unrestricted access to the brain, and it begins to replicate with terrifying speed, infecting neuron after neuron. As documented by the World Health Organization, it shows a distinct preference for specific brain regions, which explains the horrifyingly precise nature of its symptoms. It colonizes the hippocampus, disrupting memory and causing confusion. It invades the amygdala, the brain's center for fear and aggression, triggering the characteristic rage and agitation. But its most critical targets are in the brainstem, the primitive part of the brain that controls our most fundamental autonomic functions. Here, it wreaks havoc on the nerves that control swallowing, breathing, and salivation. This is not random destruction. Every single symptom of rabies is a calculated, evolutionarily honed strategy to ensure the virus's transmission to a new host. The World Health Organization estimates that rabies still kills approximately 59,000 people a year, almost all of them in developing nations where access to treatment is limited. The mortality rate, once symptoms manifest, is not 90% or 99%. It is, for all practical purposes, 100%. The most infamous symptom, hydrophobia, is a perfect example of its diabolical intelligence. The virus causes intensely painful, involuntary spasms of the pharynx, larynx, and diaphragm when the victim attempts to swallow liquids. It's not a psychological fear of water, it's a physical agony triggered by the act of swallowing. This serves a dual purpose for the virus. First, it prevents the victim from washing away the viral particles that are now being shed in massive quantities into their saliva. Second, the buildup of thick, virus-laden saliva, combined with the inability to swallow, creates the classic foaming at the mouth. The aggression is equally strategic. By turning the host into a violent biting machine, the virus maximizes its chances of being injected into another victim. The virus is, in effect, a puppeteer, pulling the strings of the host's brain to make it perform the one act necessary for its survival. As Dr. Charles Ruprecht, a leading expert and former chief of the CDC's rabies program, has stated, "The virus doesn't want to kill the host, at least not right away. It wants to borrow its brain and body to drive it like a vehicle to its next destination." We must confront the common misconception that this is simply madness. It is not. It is a highly sophisticated form of behavioral manipulation, a chilling example of one life form hijacking the consciousness of another. The rabies virus is not just an infection, it is a hostile takeover of the self. The race was on. Inside Joseph Meister's small body, the virus was creeping up his nerves toward his brain. Outside, his mother was racing toward a man who held the only key to a lock no one had ever picked. When Théodorine Meister arrived in Paris and presented her son to Louis Pasteur, she was met not with confidence, but with profound hesitation. Pasteur was a chemist, not a physician. He had never administered his experimental treatment to a human being. To do so, especially on a child who was not yet symptomatic, was to risk everything. If the treatment failed and the boy died, Pasteur could be charged with murder. If the boy never developed rabies in the first place, Pasteur could be accused of injecting a healthy child with a deadly poison. His colleagues urged him to refuse. But then he looked at Joseph, at the 14 wounds that marked him for death, and he knew he had to act. Pasteur's genius was rooted in a revolutionary idea. He hypothesized that the invisible agent of rabies, though it could not be grown in a dish, could be cultivated in the nervous tissue of a living animal. he began a long series of experiments injecting the virus from a rabid dog into the brain of a rabbit. After the rabbit died, he would harvest its spinal cord, now teeming with the virus, and use it to infect the next rabbit. By passing the virus through a succession of rabbits, he found he could increase its virulence and shorten its incubation period, creating a stable, predictable version of the pathogen to work with. His defining discovery, however, was the concept of attenuation, the ability to weaken a pathogen so it could be used to stimulate immunity without causing disease. He took the infected rabbit spinal cords and suspended them in sterile, dry air. Day by day, the exposure to air weakened or attenuated the virus within the tissue. A cord dried for 1 day was still highly virulent. A cord dried for 14 days was essentially harmless. He theorized that he could train an animal's immune system to fight the real virus. He would start by injecting a dog with the 14-day harmless cord, followed the next day by the 13-day cord, and so on, until the dog could withstand an injection of the most virulent fresh rabies virus without falling ill. He had successfully created a vaccine, but it was a preventative vaccine. Joseph Meister was already infected. Pasteur's radical gamble was that his series of injections could work after a bite, that he could stimulate the immune system to build its defenses faster than the slow-moving virus could travel to the brain. On the evening of July 6, 1885, with 2 physicians present to share the responsibility, Pasteur took a syringe filled with a preparation from a rabbit spinal cord that had been drying for 15 days. He injected it into Joseph Meister's abdomen. The treatment had begun. For the next 10 days, the boy endured 13 more injections, each one containing a progressively stronger, more virulent preparation of the virus, a countdown to the freshest and most lethal dose. The scientific world held its breath. It was a desperate, high-stakes experiment playing out in real time on a 9-year-old boy, turned into weeks. Joseph Meister did not develop a fever. He did not develop spasms. He did not develop hydrophobia. He remained a playful, healthy young boy. He lived. The revelation was monumental. Pasteur had not just saved a child. He had slain a monster that had terrified humanity for 4,000 years. He had proven that an infectious disease, even one as notoriously fatal as rabies, was not a supernatural curse, but a biological process that could be intercepted and defeated by human ingenuity. The entire paradigm had shifted. The moment Joseph Meister walked out of Pasteur's laboratory, alive and well, was the moment the age of modern immunology was truly born. The incurable had been cured. The survival of Joseph Meister was a singular event with plural world-altering implications. Its most immediate impact was the validation of vaccination as a medical strategy, transforming it from a fringe concept into a cornerstone of public health. Pasteur's success with this, post-exposure prophylaxis, a term we still use today, was so profound that it unleashed a global wave of optimism and funding. Donations poured in from around the world, leading to the establishment of the Pasteur Institute in Paris in 1887, an institution that remains at the forefront of infectious disease research. The principles he established laid the direct groundwork for the development of vaccines against diphtheria, tetanus, tuberculosis, polio, and measles, saving countless hundreds of millions of lives in the century that followed. The broader impact of this discovery was a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with the microbial world. For millennia, we had been at the mercy of invisible plagues. Pasteur's work armed us with the knowledge that these enemies could be understood, cultivated weakened, and ultimately turned against themselves. This was the dawn of proactive medicine. The idea that we did not have to wait for disease to strike, but could prepare our bodies to defeat it in advance. The story of rabies and its conquest is also a powerful narrative about universal themes. It is a story of the brutal determinism of biology, the virus's unthinking, relentless drive to replicate, colliding with the power of human reason and courage. It is the story of Theodorin Meister's refusal to surrender to fate, and of Louis Pasteur's willingness to risk his reputation and freedom on a desperate, compassionate gamble. The modern relevance of this 140-year-old story is more potent than ever in our interconnected world. Rabies remains a significant threat, primarily in Asia and Africa, a stark reminder of the deadly gap between scientific capability and global health equity. Furthermore, the rise of bat-borne Lissa viruses, which can be resistant to current vaccines, demonstrates that our battle against this ancient foe requires constant vigilance and innovation. In an age defined by the threat of emerging zoonotic diseases, from avian flu to novel coronaviruses, the core lesson of the rabies story endures. Our survival depends on rigorous scientific investigation, global cooperation, and the courage to act in the face of the unknown. We began with the image of a person in the final throes of rabies, recoiling from a glass of water, a prisoner in their own body. At first, it seemed like an act of pure, chaotic madness, but now, armed with the full context of the virus's strategy, we see it for what it truly is. It is not chaos. It is a finely tuned performance, the horrifying last act of a play written in RNA over millions of years of evolution. The terror is no longer of the unknown, but of the chillingly, rationally known. We now understand that the aggression, the delirium, and the hydrophobia are not random symptoms of a mind breaking down, but the precise manipulations of a viral puppeteer pulling the strings of the brain to achieve its single goal: transmission. My work as a scientist is a constant process of replacing fear with understanding. Yet, the story of rabies leaves me with a unique and persistent unease. It forces us to confront the profound fragility of our own consciousness. The brain, the very organ that we believe houses our identity, our free will, our soul, can be so easily commandeered. Our personality, our behaviors, our most basic drives can be rewritten by a microscopic parasite to serve its own ends. The virus doesn't just destroy the host, it wears them, turning the seat of the self into a weapon. The story of Joseph Meister is a triumph, a testament to what we can achieve. But the biology of the rabies virus is a humbling reminder that we are not entirely our own. It proves that the self is a delicate construction of chemistry and electricity, one that can be hijacked and driven by an outside intelligence. So, the next time you look in the mirror and see the thinking, feeling person staring back, ask yourself, who or what is truly in control?